Good afternoon, everyone. Chief Marshal, Mr. Bhudoria, um, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Um, First of all, I would again add to what was said right in the beginning. Having Air Chief Marshal in as part of the UP Defense Corridor as the Chief Nodal Officer is truly a privilege, and I think has invigorated the entire defense industry in the state. So we very much thank Air Chief Marshal for uh, joining this and helping us, the defense industry in the state, in this journey. Um, I will take on where my friend Neeraj left off regarding exports, but I will add some additional figures and numbers to it so we try to understand the context uh, of what we are dealing with in terms of the $1 trillion economy and the role of exports and defense in this economy. So in 2021, India's GDP was around $3.1 trillion. India's export was about 400 billion. In, and as well as total GDP that we are targeting is 5 trillion for the country. So in context of the current export percentage, which is around 14% of the GDP, that would roughly translate to about a $700 billion export uh, in the economy. However, if we compare that to a country like China, in the previous year they had a economy of around $17.5 trillion with an export of around 3.5 trillion, which is roughly 20% of the size of the GDP. In order to leapfrog from a 1 point or 3.1 trillion economy to a 5 trillion economy, India's exports needs to go from 400 billion to maybe 700 billion or maybe even 1 trillion if we compare it, keep the Chinese percentage in mind. But what happens to UP? UP is currently at, or the previous year was around $270 billion economy approximately, out of which the total exports were about 20 billion, which constitutes about 5% of the India's exports. But as a percentage of UP's GDP, it is around 7 or 8%, comparing that to India's GDP's percentage of export, which is around 14%. So in order for the country to go, or for the state to go from 270 billion to 1 trillion, it will at least require a par level of 14 to 15% GDP coming from exports, which would mean about a 150 billion to 200 billion worth of exports coming out of a $1 trillion economy, which is a massive challenge. This means that whatever the state is doing, it's doing amazingly well in terms of its new policy reforms, the push to industry, new industrial policies, incentives. But depending only on our current strengths of agriculture, food, will only provide us incremental growth, not a leapfrog from 20 billion export to 150 billion export, or from a $270 billion economy to a $1 trillion economy. What it requires is bringing in and identifying and bringing in those manufacturing and industries within the state which are untapped and has massive potential in the future. both in the country as well as outside of the country. One such industry or one such subsector, and it again is quite a privilege that Air Chief Marshal Mr. Bhadoria is also here, is related to aero engines and gas turbines. Just to again give some numbers, this is based on some simulation which was recently done and studies which were made. What is expected over the next 2 decades, over the next 20 years in India, there are going to be requirements for 1,000 turbine engines for fighter aircrafts, 1,000 replacement engines for fighter aircrafts, 700 engines for trainer aircrafts, 4,000 engines for 3 to 6 ton class helicopters, 1,000 for 10 to 13 ton class helicopters, and 3,000 engines for combat drones. Besides this, 2,000 turbine engines for 2 ton medium altitude long endurance drones, 3,000 for cruise missiles, and 2,000 for target drones. And this excludes the civilian application, where over the next decade, India is supposed to buy over 2,000 civilian aircrafts. If we talk about just the engines, by some, on top of that, in the MRO activities, the maintenance repair of engines, aero engines, more than 2/3 of the cost is attributed to spares and components, which is where a huge play comes for MSMEs. And that is why it is a very good and important segment for the state to look at. Aero engine technology does not exist in India. India has been trying for a long time, but it is getting closer. But not just bringing the aero engine technology, but creating a full ecosystem and a supply chain around it, right from materials to components to everything. Over the next 2 decades, across the board, across all services, land, marine, naval, air, strategic systems, it is expected that aero engines will, in the capital expenditure that is done by the defense, more than 20% of that spend is going to be related to aero engines of the entire defense capital expenditure. So if, as a state, we develop and identify specifically policies and focus towards one such big segment of defense and aerospace, it can bring in massive opportunities to the state, as well as huge employment and job creation possibilities. UP has come out with again a new industrial policy, and again a new defense manufacturing policy as well, which is providing a lot of incentives, and I would urge all my industry friends to take a look at it. It is because it is really shows the intent of the UP government to push and attract industries into the state. But there's one more request I would make to the officials of the state, to look at subsectoral opportunities and create specific policies to target that in terms of financial incentives, in terms of and many other things, so that UP can be created as an aero engine cluster of excellence, where a lot of MSMEs and some large players can interact, can work together to create a huge and convert, in fact, a huge opportunity that is there within the country and for exports. So thank you very much for this opportunity.